Thank you, Karen. And as we get our first panel installed on the stage, let me just make a point about moderating. You know, we've got a lot of very smart people here today with a lot of things to say. But as a moderator, you know, we are pretty tough-minded and relentless people. We have no qualms in cutting people off in mid-sentence. So I'll ask all our panelists and speakers today to follow the guidance of their particular moderator, and please try and stick to your time limits because it helps us a lot. And if you don't, I've actually had USC's engineers install trapdoors under the seats. I have the switch, and it's a long way to fall from California to New South Wales. Our first panel today, the moderator is Jeffrey Wiseman, who's a professor of international relations here at USC, and his two speakers are Kim Beasley, who's the Australian ambassador to the United States, and Jeff Bleich, who's recently ended his tour as the US ambassador to Australia. Take it away, Jeff.
Thanks, Terry. Welcome to everyone. This is a great honour and even a humbling one to be moderating to these two ambassadors. I will not go through their bios, but as you can see from the conference booklet, their careers are absolutely stellar. They have wonderful insights on the Australia, US, Asia Pacific nexus, if you like. One of the difficulties, or one of the big principles of diplomacy is precedence. So as moderator, I had to decide who would speak first. And my only reasoning here was that there are so many Australians living in Los Angeles, most of them in the film industry, that we regard Los Angeles as home turf, home territory. So on that basis, I'm going to invite Ambassador Bleich to speak first, and then Ambassador Beasley after that. Ambassador Bleich, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you also to USC and to G'day USA for hosting this. And I want to commend the organizers for kicking this off with a couple of ambassadors. You know, we normally don't get this sort of call. There's that old saying about diplomats, which is a diplomat is a person who always thinks twice before saying nothing. But I think Kim and I have always prided ourselves on being undiplomatic diplomats, and so I will try and give a quick overview, as quick as I can, of the rebalance between 2009 and today, 2014. And then Kim is going to fill in all the points that I missed, and also talk a bit about where that partnership is going with respect to our alliance in Southeast Asia and throughout Asia. Let me just describe the situation when I arrived in 2009. 2009, there was a general narrative in the media, particularly in Australia, that the United States, having been committed to protracted engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq, where our service members were doing 3, 4, 5 tours of duty, and where we had spent billions and billions of dollars, and also facing a tremendous global financial crisis which had tanked our stock markets and had cost us millions of jobs, was too depleted, too distracted to be able to maintain its traditional partnership engagement with Australia and to be devoted to the region. And there was a steady drumbeat of concern about how Australia would fare with a diminished United States engagement in the region. There was even a book that came out that became sort of played on these fears called The China Choice by Hugh White, which is based on an article he'd written, which basically said, you know, we need to start cutting deals with other countries because the U.S. is going to recede from the region, or ham-handedly try to reinsert itself in a way which would be counterproductive to the region. And Australia and the U.S., we spent some time behind the scenes talking about these fears, these concerns, and what we actually were going to do, not what people worried we were going to do. And our commitment was, rather than you know, give in to these fears or concerns, step back from the traditional relationship, to do just the opposite, to double down on that relationship. And so our commitment was to not only maintain our traditional commitments in this region, but to increase dramatically our commitment to the region, because it was and is the rising region in the world, the greatest center for economic growth and demographic change on the planet today. And so we did it in 3 different ways. As Karen mentioned, people tended to fixate on the security element of it. But let me talk about the 3 elements. The first was simply greater diplomatic engagement. Those familiar with the region know that the regional architecture of the Asia-Pacific has traditionally been something of an alphabet soup, with lots of different organizations with modestly overlapping jurisdictions, but their own separate interests, some of which, and none of which had all of the key players involved. We signed on to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. It allowed us to become a member of ASEAN as opposed to just an observer. It allowed us to join the East Asia Summit at the principals level, where the president would be attending East Asia Summit meetings. And we put a lot of energy into the East Asia Summit because it is the one body that has all of the major economic powers in Asia. We reinvigorated our efforts in APEC. We joined the IOR ARC, focused on the Indian Ocean, and in many other ways became embedded in the architecture. At the same time, we started working on improving our bilateral relations with all our partners and allies in the region, expanding our relationships with countries like Burma, and then working on trilateral agreements. And we worked together, for example, U.S., Japan, Australia, U.S., New Zealand, Australia, U.S., Korea, Australia, different ways in which we could increase this, and we're looking at ways to increase our footprint with India and Indonesia. So diplomatically, we did a full-on offensive. Economically, we had a number of initiatives to engage even more forcefully in the region, the National Export Initiative. We are currently on track to double exports to Australia in the 5-year period that I'm describing. And with this is a mature relationship with long-standing distribution channels and already had a free trade agreement. No one would have expected you could double exports there. We've been doing even more in some of the developing countries in this region. Investment, we are now by far the largest investor in Australia. To give you some metric, the U.S.-Australia bilateral portfolio investment is 20 times that of Australia's bilateral portfolio investment with China. So that just gives you some sense of how deep this is. Even in terms of tourism, the U.S. is now the largest destination for Australians. In fact, more than Fiji, more than Bali, more than New Zealand, places that you would expect would be the #1 tourist destination for Australians. And likewise, even with the exchange rates that made it very expensive for Americans to go to Australia, we've had record U.S. tourism in Australia over the last 3 years. That was just on the bilateral front. On the multilateral front, we championed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has been, which will, if it comes through as we hope it will, Minister Rob, and First Secretary DeCure, if it goes forward as we hope it will have 40% of the world's GDP in one free trade agreement and be one of the most profound and important trade agreements in this region. Then finally, militarily, I think it's well known, we've expanded our training together, we've expanded our use of facilities together, and we have increased our, we've rebalanced our Navy. We had 50-50 between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Now 60% of our naval assets are in the Pacific, reflecting the fact that it's important to have open seas and open communications and for us to all train together so we know each other's capabilities and intentions. And we also know that it's going to be critical for us to be able to respond together in humanitarian disasters and to provide disaster relief. The impact of this, if you look at where we were 4 years ago and where we are today, the Australian economy during the time I was there went from 14th largest economy in the world to the 12th largest economy in the world. The United States went from having a Dow Jones that was at 6,500 to over 16,000. In every way, you see both of our countries moving in very, very positive directions. The U.S. is out of Afghanistan. It's refocused out of Iraq. It's refocused in Afghanistan. Will be out shortly with our Australian partners. We have refocused our efforts, our finances, our vision on this region. And we know we've got some challenges ahead. These challenges include resource scarcity. The challenges include cyber activities. Resources include just getting the rule of law right so that people share resources effectively and share space effectively in the region. But we know we can do it because Australia is a focal point for this. We have no, I was going to say we have no better friend in the world than Australia before handing this over to Kim, but I did that once at a Australia Day event, and after I raised a glass and said we have no better friend in the world than Australia, Kim got up and said, well, sort of a costly thing to say. Not saying that you like us less than anyone else, but you're not saying you like us anymore. So let me just say for this room, Australia, you are our best friend in the world. We just don't want to tick off all our other friends, so keep it in the room. But with that, I turn it over to my great friend and a phenomenal ambassador and a true legend of Australian politics and leadership, Kim Beazley.
Thanks, Jeff. Look, there's no better thing to be than an American ambassador to Australia. You go rather pro-consular. And Australians are fascinated with you and they expect definitive statements on a weekly basis. And the difference between Jeffrey and most American ambassadors to Australia, they got them from him and loved him accordingly. And it's good to be here with Jeff too, who's a professor here at USC, but when I first knew Jeff, he was an assistant to a ministerial colleague of mine then, Gareth Evans, and he was an official of the Australian Foreign Affairs Department. His presence here reflects something about USC and California generally, which I think is enormously important. Way before there was a rebalance or pivot, California and the Californian academic institutions and their international relations intellectual endeavour was there. They'd already worked that one out, and there was an enormous focus here on that, and you can sell it too. If you look through the staff lists and the course structure here at USC, you can see that more than adequately reflected in the things that are taught. I'm going to speak very briefly. One of my two bosses is going to speak later, and I'm not going to steal an ounce of his thunder. He is going to talk in great detail about the economic trading situation both between the two countries bilaterally and more generally in the region. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk I'm going to briefly situate the rebalance in the context of if you like, Australian-American geostrategics, and I can do it historically based on my own experience. When I was Defence Minister in the 1980s, and I was Australia's last Cold War Defence Minister, we had an argument with the then Reagan administration, and that argument took place at the Presidio up in San Francisco, in which Australia had presented a suggestion that in future our military planning would be based on assumption of dominating militarily in a self-reliant way Australia's approaches. You can only do that because of the excellence of American intelligence and the excellence of American weapon systems, which as part of the alliance Australia obtained. Nevertheless, at that point of time in the Cold War, where the emphasis was on alliances as part of an American extended deterrence system, there was a question mark in the American mind as to what we were up to. And Cap Weinberger wanted to tease that out. So he had this knockdown, drag out at the Presidio that went for a couple of hours, and his military assistant sort of interrupted it halfway through and said, "Gentlemen, you can be heard 2 corridors away. It's time to go to the barbecue." To which I responded, "I thought that's where we were." And, but the interesting thing was, at the end of it, he said, "Okay, that's fine. Go ahead. It's not a big problem for us. The things that are important to you and important to us in what you do are guaranteed." And so they were, but what was important? Well, what was important was that we provided America with half its early warning. The US president carrying that football around can launch an American nuclear strike on 15 minutes notice. Problem: the distant early warning radar system gave you 15 minutes notice of a massive Soviet nuclear strike. The Australian facility at Narungga added 15 minutes. So that at least gave a US president the opportunity to contemplate whether or not the United States was experiencing a massive Soviet nuclear strike or merely a misreading of the Aurora Borealis. So it wasn't unimportant that. The second is you didn't have Trident submarines then, you had Polaris Poseidons, they operated in the Indian Ocean. So the VLF communications that operated out of Western Australia was essential for communicating fire orders to the submarines operating in that zone. Thirdly, at Pine Gap, and even now we can't talk very much about it, but one of its functions was to effectively monitor the development of Soviet missile systems, which gave the United States a clear-cut impression about what was underway for them. So that was our contribution to the Western Alliance. And the Americans basically said to the Australians, well, if that's what you're doing, and you're going to persist with that, we really don't care what else you do. Well, why didn't they care about what else we did? Because the region we inhabited was of no significance to the United States at all. In 1969, the US President, then Richard Nixon, said, we will implement the Nixon Doctrine, which in areas of secondary importance we will ensure our people looking after themselves will help them out, but we are not going to devote any American strategic thinking to it. So in the Cold War structure of alliances and of flashpoints, there's a flashpoint in North Asia, there's a flashpoint in the Middle East, there's a flashpoint in Europe, there is none in Southeast Asia. If the Australians were fascinated with Southeast Asia, and that was our area of strategic interest, fine for them, didn't worry the Americans what we did. What happened when President Obama said decisively that the United States was rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific region, he said this: the focal point of global politics has changed. It used to be those three flashpoints, it is no longer. The focal point now is the Asia-Pacific zone, the Indo-Pacific zone. The centre point of it has shifted south. It used to be North Asia, now it's more into the Southeast Asian archipelago. The United States rebalance doesn't mean all that much in terms of American relations with China, Japan and South Korea. They've always been strong, much stronger than Australian relations. Americans know much more about China than we do. But it's round now into Southeast Asia. That is what counts. That is now the focal point of that rebalance. So when you contemplate that, we went from being a strategic backwater in the 1980s to the southern tier of the most important zone for the United States in the world, strategically and economically, where the Marines are going in Darwin, where the air bases are growing across the north of Australia. Those facilities are closer to the South China Seas than they are to Melbourne. There is a value geographically to the United States in Australia that did not exist before. So when you sit down and try to think and imagine in your minds the strategic geography of the rebalance, and we talk about the economy and all the rest of it, there's a reason why President Obama was interested in enhancing collaboration with Australia. And the reason is Australia is now about as important a piece of strategic geography to the United States as any other part of the globe has been at any point of time in the history of the last 100 years.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Beasley. So now the floor is open to you. We do have 10 minutes, and I do see someone with an electronic device over there for enhancing voices. So if you could give your name and identify your affiliation, that would be extremely helpful. I see a question there from David Carl, I believe.
I'm David Carl. I run a consulting firm called Asia Strategy Initiative that helps U.S. businesses understand political risks in Asia. There was reference made to Hugh White and his argument critical of the U.S. strategic pivot to Asia, and arguing instead that the United States should cede hegemony to China, at least in the Western Pacific. And I understand that at least one former Prime Minister of Australia has subscribed to this argument, and perhaps not. Do you think this argument is an outlier, or do you think it will gain currency in Australian leadership circles?
I think
this, or is this not on? I think that's an argument that is completely wrong. And Hugh used to work for me, and I didn't do a good enough job, and that's quite obvious. Though he's a very good strategist, and he's got a very good set of arguments. We've got a problem, though, arguing this point now, and that is that during the Cold War, the essence of defence structures was transparency. The essence of deterrence was you had to know exactly what the other side was capable of doing to you, doing you for, and if you didn't comprehend that, then deterrence didn't work. So there was transparency. There is no transparency now. I would say this, and it is quite possible that what's happening to the Defence Department in Congress at the moment will change this. But I would say, being a rebriefed person again, I was a briefed person once in the 1980s, being a rebriefed person then again, I would say that the US military strength, capabilities of US platforms, is probably a bit greater now vis-a-vis China or anyone else than it was 10 years ago. The Americans are going exponentially brilliant in the capabilities of their platforms and exponentially secret in the way in which they handle information about it. So the disadvantage of that is the United States loses political saliency to some extent, given the extent of secrecy that they have to employ. But the reality is that from the Australian point of view, we don't do those comparisons. As far as we're concerned, we trade with China, we're friends with China. The essence of good Australian statesmanship ought to be directed towards where American statesmanship is anyway. And that is, their view is, we're not in the business of a military competition here. We're in the business of a collaborative development for an activity for prosperity. The US is operating on that assumption in its relations with China. It is much more deeply engaged with China than Australia is, and always will be, because China will always treat the United States much more seriously than it does Australia. So I do think a lot of that argument in Australia is just punching at things. I suspect the Prime Minister you're talking about is Malcolm Fraser. When I used to be Leader of the Opposition, I used to go to the grand final, and Malcolm Fraser was always at the North Melbourne breakfast, as I was. And whenever I went in there, Malcolm would say to me, "How are you going?" And I'd say, "Still trying to get to the left of you, Malcolm." And Malcolm would say, "You'll never make it."
Just a very quick translation: grand final equals Super Bowl.
Yeah, and look, as usual, Ambassador Beasley and I are standing, shoulder to face on this issue. But let me just refine the U.S. perspective a little bit on this. We don't think either one of the doomsday scenarios, which is laid out by some academics, was ever possible. The U.S. is not going to recede from the most important economic region in the world right at the time that it was about to flourish after putting in 50 years of investment in it. Now we're suddenly going to abandon the region. No one ever imagined we would do that. Similarly, no one thinks we want to contain China or prevent it from reaching its economic potential. Our economies are deeply, deeply interdependent. Our whole goal is to help use the influence that we have in the region to help it rise successfully. Make sure it's sustainable growth, make sure that it's not going to go off a cliff because of resource constraints or long-standing animosities flaring up during this period of prosperity. So our goal was always to remain engaged in a respectful way that reflected our role, which has always been one about trying to see the Asia-Pacific rise. The kind of scenarios that were spun out were never seriously contemplated by policymakers.
I think we have time for one or two very quick questions. Yes, could you identify yourself for us? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Adela. I'm a junior at USC, and I'm majoring in environmental security. And I'll actually be studying at ANU in the coming year. So I just had a quick question, piggybacking off the last comment. Where do you see the future of U.S. military relations with Australia headed, especially given the light of the recent Chinese military growth?
Well, we can both take a shot at this first. Congratulations on getting into ANU, and I know you're going to love Canberra. My family and I loved it there. In terms of what we're doing militarily, if you look at what the Marines are doing, we are spending a lot of time training together with Australia, but also training with Malaysians, with Indonesians, with Singaporeans, and opening up our training exercises to everyone. And China's been invited to, I think, over 100 different U.S. training exercises. But we also do our largest training exercise in the world every year, Talisman Sabre. This year we had 20,000 American troops, 10,000 Australian troops working together, and again, we bring in observers from the region. The idea is the more we train together, the more you build relations with leaders in different militaries, the less likely it is that you will make a mistake, a miscalculation, misunderstand another country's intentions or their capabilities, or you have some incident, an accident at sea, and instead of people immediately jumping to the wrong conclusions, they've got someone who they can call, you know, a colonel who they used to work with in training exercises and say, what was that all about? Those are the things that help settle out a region when you are going to have growing defense forces. That's natural. As you get more money, you have bigger everything, including defense forces. We don't find that to be off-putting. What we are concerned about is making sure we all know each other and we develop some real trust for each other, and that's really the focus of our engagement in the region.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I'd take it just a point further. Firstly, glad you're going to the ANU. They do actually have, good though USC is, the largest collection of Pacific scholars anywhere on the globe is at the ANU. So you're going to go from an intellectual powerhouse into another one, and you won't miss a beat. I take it a point further. From the point of view of Australia, when you look at the way in which we plan for the defence of the zone around us, and we think a good Australian defence is also important to stability in the region, is technological. And what gives, we don't have a population position or even now a financial position that in any way, shape or form makes Australia a dominant power in the region in which it exists. What we do have is a capacity via our relationship with the United States to be excellent. So we will be more and more dependent upon an intelligence exchange with the United States. We're getting that. When some of those joint facilities I referred to have now become effectively obsolete. In the case of Northwest Cape, it now communicates more with Australian submarines than it does American, because Trident submarines don't operate in that zone. In the case of the early warning facility, you do that now with satellite data crosslinks to ground stations in the US. You don't need to bounce them through a facility in Australia. So we've gone redundant in that area. Not quite so in relation to the capacities of Pine Gap, but there are new developments in space situational awareness and space telecoms. We're moving into the next generation of collaboration on comprehending the strategic environment globally and in spatial terms. So that's important. Then in terms of the region around us, the capabilities that we acquire from the United States, we acquire the weapon systems that really work, though we pay for them, which is a very important thing, and not all your friends do. And we're going in that direction. But then diplomatically, the simple fact of the matter is this: there's no agreements on maritime boundaries in Southeast Asia, none, and there probably won't be. So that means that these powers, which are now moving away from armed forces defined in the context of maintaining order at home, to developing a force projection capability, have got something to project force about. Bad. That's not something that you want to see operate purely unchecked. There is only one power in the world that philosophically is attuned to holding the ring and in terms of national interest, relatively disinterested in terms of the region. They haven't got any barrow really of their own to push, is the United States. So if there's going to be a peaceful settlement of all these issues or a peaceful maintenance of order in relation to all these issues, it'll either be played by the United States and we'll all rise to prosperity, or it won't be, in which case we'll all get these niggles all over the place, people are going to be miserable, and some of them will fight. And that is why the presence of the US is critical, and we need to do what we can to encourage the US to stay.
I think we have time for one more final question. If someone would like to take that opportunity. Yes, sir. Could you give your name and identify your affiliation?
For either of the ambassadors or both. One of the things I've noticed is that in all the discussion, of the U.S. Marines in Darwin, no one wants to call it a base. It seems like the wording of that rotational force I hear, and then I hear a lot of talk about it not being a base. My first question would be, as non-diplomatic diplomats, why is that the case? Is there local sensitivities, and what is the acceptance of that? And the second thing I've noticed is that no one also wants to talk about China when we talk about U.S. military presence in Australia. It seems that no one wants to say this is about China, but yet the vast majority of the people out there would assume it's about China. So as non-diplomats,
okay, so first, the reason that it's not referred to as a base is because it's not a base, and we're actually being accurate. It is a facility that is an Australian facility. They own it, they control it, we are there as their guests, and we only train 6 months out of the year. To call that a U.S. base just would be a misstatement. It would also be, perceived, I think, by the Australian public and by political leaders as a dramatic shift in how the U.S. and Australia have always operated together. We have not operated with bases there. We've had at most joint facilities such as Pine Gap, which the ambassador mentioned. So that's the reason for it. It's to be accurate. And when people try to use the word base, they're trying to use it to create some sort of political firestorm, and so that's why I think you hear us resisting it. I think similarly, you said you never hear anyone saying China. Well, you hear everyone saying China who's not in the policymaking world. And again, they're trying to stir something up. It's a much sexier story that, the U.S. and China are, we're like, PETA and the other guy in the Hunger Games fighting over Katniss, and, who will choose, in Australia, you're Katniss. That's a sexy story to sell. The real reason, so the reason we don't buy into it and we don't say it is because it's really not about China. All the nations in this region are growing. Indonesia is a G20 country. Vietnam will be a G20 country. This is, there's a lot of growth in this region and a lot of possibility for misunderstanding, miscalculation of different countries' intentions as they rise. And so the opportunity is to work together with all of them, start building some protocols that we all share, and hopefully reduce the possibility of inadvertent conflict.
Well, I'd only just add one or two things to it. You're not about basing overseas anymore. You have a number that are bases overseas now. They're legacies of an era, and they're important politically still. So you'll stay in Korea, you'll stay in Japan for that sort of reason. But you'd dearly love not to be there, because the capacity of the United States Armed Forces these days is very different from what it was then. And it makes much more sense for you to do massive base rationalisation back here in the United States, and to where you need to do it, and you're going to have a devil loan to pay trying to persuade Congress to shut bases in their own facilities and build the sort of mega bases in one or two areas, which you've got to do if you're going to be able to afford your defence of what you're prepared to pay now. You're not about building bases overseas and telling a congressman it's closing in your area, mate, but it's opening in Australia. So there's philosophically, it's not philosophically, strategically, or tactically, the US now is about forward basing. So you would use using forward facilities, but not basing there. So it's for forward facilities rather than forward bases. And so classically, from the American point of view, the pattern that's established in Darwin is what the Americans want to do everywhere, if they could. You can't quite do it yet because there are political reasons why you can't. And the reason why we don't talk about China is it's not all about China. This is a new sub-region of the global political system that is inherently unstable but very prosperous. We've never had a part of the globe like this before. So China's not the only big country in this area. You've got India, you've got Vietnam, you've got Indonesia. They all have different views about their security. Some of them relate to China, often they don't. And, but what they need is stability. One of the principles, These is the last part of the globe who are devotees of the Treaty of Westphalia. These people actually believe in the nation state. These countries believe in things like national sovereignty. They don't believe that anymore in Europe. And it never really counted that much, or it does count a bit in South America, but it's always been heavily compromised there. Let me tell you, in Asia, they would be proud of them, those who negotiated the treaty back in 1648, because they would recognise them all absolutely. So you've got a bunch of people, big on sovereignty, low on agreement. So you want to be, if you're operating in this zone, you want to have a bit of a punch, because people do talk to you when you've got a bit of a punch. Otherwise, they're not likely to. And that was really all about, the Treaty of Westphalia was about recognising everybody else's punches and respecting them. And in that sort of circumstances, it's good to have a military friend like the United States, and it would be absolutely disastrous, including for China, if the US wasn't there.
I think the Treaty of Westphalia is a very fitting note on which to end this panel. It was a little surprising for the moderator, but a very pleasant surprise. So to Ambassador Blake and Ambassador Beasley, we thank you so much for a terrific start to the day. Thank you.